I'm going to bring a focus on government. And I think for most of you in the room, the idea of pairing government with innovation is an oxymoron. But I want to talk about the innovation imperative within government. I am not talking about government's role in helping businesses be innovative, but innovating the role, the form, and the culture of government itself. It's a necessity across Europe. Governments are facing challenges that are unprecedented. Budgets are being cut in ways that make the problem not one of process improvement, but really of strategic improvement. And the business link here, I think, is that there are lots of parallels. There are lessons to be learned, and the opportunity to innovate government is both an opportunity to create new markets and to bring the talents of industry into government. This is the question I think that we're debating in Europe, and I think unfortunately too much of the conversation seems to be focused around efficiency. It seems as if the leaders of Europe think that everything is more or less okay. It's just a matter of greater efficiency. And in fact, I'm actually going to argue that it's a question of redesign. We need to fundamentally redesign what the role of government is, how it behaves, and the products and services, so to speak, that it delivers. And I think there's been the moment of horror. This is from Rosemary's Baby, one of the first sort of horror movies. And I think one way to think about horror is that moment when you realize that everything you have been looking at that seems so familiar, you suddenly realize it's something other than you thought. It's the moment when you realize that the ketchup is blood. It's the moment when you realize the carpet is actually snakes. It's the moment that the thing that seems so familiar, you go, oh my God, I've been looking at the world completely wrong. And what has fundamentally changed? What has fundamentally changed is the context. The context of government. I will argue, and I'll take the example of Finland, where I come from, but I think this is a narrative that is more or less true across Europe. That the purpose of government was to help nation building and to shift from fundamentally agrarian to industrialized, from living in farms to living in cities. And the purpose of government was clear, the purpose of education was clear, was to teach the skills for people to go into factories. And I think actually the context has changed dramatically. The digital world has hit us. We're in a world where boundaries mean less and less. Even the idea of nations may be disappearing. The prominence of cities is coming back. And actually maybe there isn't one clear future, but there are many futures now that we need to deal with. But it's the fundamental shift in the context. And so we can't keep improving the solution that was built to serve one transition. We need to build a completely new solution. But this is a European response, right? When Greece started to hit its economic woes, the Troika came in and put conditions on the reform. And the idea for me of reform is how do you change from state A to a better state B? And if you're watching TV on this June evening, the main news, this is what you would have seen.
Λοιπόν, έχουμε αποφασίσει ότι εμείς συνεχίζουμε.
Μπορεί να πάμε σταμμένα στον αύριο χώρο. Ναι, είναι από έρχονται από παντού.
So in the middle of the TV program, the state TV station was pulled off the air. And why was that? This is how you do cuts. You just cut things off, right? And it's amazing to think that leadership in Europe thinks that the world has been given to us. You have 9 boxes, and the future will be determined by the boxes that you were given, not the boxes that you could create. And so invariably the mindset is, we got to make one of the boxes small, or maybe we need to cut it out, or maybe we just shrink everything, or we reorganize the boxes. We're limited by our past, not empowered by our future. And the efficiency argument is to try to shrink the past. And what I'm arguing is we need to create a new future. We saw this in Finland, where our president said the time for discussion is over. Now politicians need to present their lists of services to be cut. Where are we going to get these savings? Now, savings are always going to be an incredibly important part of running either a company or running government. But you can't go savings first. You actually have to understand what is your new proposition and allow that proposition to inform what can you jettison and what new things do you need to invest in. But if you just start by thinking about what will you cut, we will just have a smaller yesterday. So I'd like to posit three very basic innovation, or I would call design principles for government. One is, let's stop talking about smaller government. This is not the purpose. The size of government is not the purpose. We want to talk about smarter government. And actually, personally, if government were uber smart, it could be as big as it wants, right? As long as it provides well-being, opportunity for growth, fulfillment, happiness, you name it. The second is, we need to stop this conversation about improving the past, as if the concept of education is more or less okay, and all we need to do is to increase the classroom sizes, or maybe get some tablets in there, but it's fundamentally okay. No, we need to fundamentally design the future. And the third one is we need to actually invest in innovation. There's actually a lot of rhetoric in Europe, in governments, about innovation. I think people have woken up to this idea that, you know what, we can't just keep doing what we've been doing. We need to come up with a different way of governing. But then when I ask people, well, how much are you investing in this innovation mission? Guess what? It's about €0. I'll come back to this, but I think this is a very important aspect. But why is it so difficult? Why is it so difficult for government to say, we need to shift from administering the past to actually redesigning the future? Well, first of all, is we live in a different world. We're fundamentally dealing with 21st century world, but operating through 18th century institutions. And so one of my favorites in Finland is the Ministry of Transportation and Telecommunication. Whoever came up with this idea of creating this institution? Probably, maybe in the 17th, 18th century when we were building our first train tracks, somebody thought it would be a good idea to put phone lines to follow the tracks. And when we were building our first network of transportation infrastructure, somebody said, you know what, it's probably a good idea to put the pony with the mail to run along those roads. So back then it made a lot of sense to help integrate the way we move and the way we communicate. But come on, does that make any sense today? The way I tweet obeys none of the principles of the way I fly. And yet we're trying to deal with these issues from institutions that come from a different world. Likewise, if we look at all the challenges we have in Finland, aging. We're the second fastest aging country after Japan in the world. Where's our aging ministry? We don't have it. Climate change. Where's our sustainable development ministry? Well, guess what? We don't have it. I need to go to about 5 different ministries. Ministry of Trade and Employment to get energy. Ministry of Transportation and Communications to get the transportation bit. Ministry of Housing to get the building development bit. The ministry, and so on and so on. And I actually have to try to make them work in an integrated manner. And what I learned is these are very deeply different cultures. Even though they sit under the rubric of government, they have their internal metrics. They have their internal objectives. They have their internal objectives to maintain their internal budgets. Not to actually create value for some other ministry. And guess what? We tried to hire a designer to work between 3 ministries. And in Finland we have government official pay salaries. They go A21, A22, they tell you what rank salary you get. And guess what? The 3 ministries had the same rankings, but they meant different things. So one ministry, an A21 salary, is a completely different thing from another ministry's A21 salary. And we had a really hard time just hiring somebody and agreeing on what the salary level is between 3. So it's not because people don't have the will to do good. It's because the institutional structure and cultures prevents that potential from being applied. So that's number one. I think the second one is this whole idea of how we govern. That on the one hand we have politicians, and on the other hand we have public servants. In some places, power goes off, but it comes back. But in some places there's a big firewall between these two. Right? For example, in Helsinki, It's not good for civil servants to talk to politicians because it's seen as lobbying or influencing the role of politicians. And yet, how can we even think about things that we've never done before if there isn't an active dialogue about how do you create a vision, which is a politician's job, better future is this way, and a public servant's job, which is to say, if we want to go there, this is how we do it technically. Those things have to be in dialogue when you're doing new things. This is from 2008, the first time when Bush spoke about the economic crisis, the subprime crisis in public. He said, it turns out, he actually didn't know. And what turns out? That when there's an economic problem in the financial markets, it affects the whole system. The top leadership has a very hard time understanding the interconnected nature of these complex problems. And Alan Greenspan, who is considered a financial and monetary genius, perhaps the most, said, you know what? I actually thought I understood this thing, how the world is interconnected, and I had data for 40 years to tell me that I was right, only to wake up and realize that I was wrong. So we don't actually have the capacity to deal with these large challenges that governments have to face. This is the story of my country, Finland. This is GDP growth per capita index of 1900. So if I earned €1 back then, today I earn about 14 euros. This curve, you can find it across Europe, in the US, slightly different, but fundamentally tells the same story. It's an amazing story of growth. And if you went sometime in the 1930s, this is what Finland looked like. What did we have? We had moose, we had trees, we had woods, and we had lakes. And people lived like this. An incredibly poor, agrarian country. And within literally 5 minutes, we had built schools, institutions, the Nordic welfare model. That transition where the curve climbs up was incredible. And it didn't happen by some great engagement process or really by any democratic process. It was a small elite that decided top down how things were going to do. And actually it delivered a lot of benefit. We think about elites as being a negative thing, as top down as being negative, but in this context, it actually provided a lot of greatness. And there was no debate around these things. There was no need to talk about these things, right? Gold was pouring from the sky. One day I had nothing, the next day I have a hospital. One day I have nothing, I have a job and have school. I'm living longer. And instilled was a belief of how you lead, of what are the models of success, because this curve was so steep. And in the process, success breeded a contempt. Not only did we do that in this moment, but we built our political system. This is the Farmers' Party. And Finland was built on basically 3 parties. The Farmers' Party, the Workers' Party, and the third one I actually can't remember right now. The farmers, the workers, and the employer party. So basically businesses, workers, and farmers. This was natural in a political landscape, where the transformation was from agrarian to industrial, where it meant that you had your own farm to being an employee in a company. And so the political debate was through these 3 parties. And you know what? They're still the same ruling parties. And yet the agrarian question has kind of disappeared. We have a huge digital question. We have an international, a borderless world, and we're trying to figure it out through our political system. So I'm just repeating the same mantra. The systems that govern us, the culture that govern us, the ideas of what success were born in this incredible growth that happened. In fact, the chief economist of the Bank of England, since 1750, has taken around 50 years for living standards to double. Right? From the Industrial Revolution to today, it took about 50 years to double. Before 1750, it would have taken 6,000 years for standards to grow. So this is just to show you that this curve, while it's the finished curve, applies right across. And there were instilled the principles of what good governance, good economics, good leadership means. And there's somehow the belief, even though that what worked so well in the past will just continue to work in the future, right? And actually the reality, if we look at GDP growth per capita, is this in Finland. And I would argue that there's a big cultural delta between the reality and what people assume. And while people speak about the challenges of the economic context, they're still children of this past culture. And it's really hard to get them to behave differently. To actually say, you know what, while these ideas worked really well in the past, and these are ideas that I'm comfortable with, I need to give up. I need to do something else. I need to fundamentally change. And this creates, I think, a kind of bias of the status quo. There's a certain way of running government, there's a certain way of doing things, there's certain metrics. These really cloud our ability to see what could be. In Finland, sorry, I wanted to tell just briefly, even a question of risk. So I was involved in a big development project, and we were trying to get wood to be approved as a material for large-scale construction. Now in Finland, up until 2 years ago, you could not build large structures out of wood. And the simple reason is that most people believe that wood burns, so it's a safety issue. Now you want to build out of wood because the alternative, concrete, is very energy intensive, has a big carbon footprint, and we actually have to import a lot of those materials to Finland. Whereas, as you know, all we have in Finland is wood. So not only could we use an indigenous material, but it also helps create a carbon sink for Finland, because each time you grow a tree, you're basically absorbing carbon from the environment. You're storing it in a building, and you're growing a new tree. So the more you build out of wood, the greater your carbon sink is. This could have huge impact, not just on the economy of Finland, but on the environmental impact and a made in carbon-free country potential that brings. But no. And yet in Sweden, they've been building large structures out of wood for 25 years. How is that possible? Because believe me, Finland and Sweden are more or less the same. We're in the same climate zone, so geopolitically the same, we're the same size, we're culturally the same, we're based on the same kind of Nordic model. And so, how is it possible that one group, looking at the technical facts, because the debate was on technical grounds, says, no, wood does not burn. And the other group says, yes, wood does burn. Because this is not a technical problem, this is a deeply cultural problem. We see risk where someone else sees opportunity. And if you don't understand the deeply cultural problem that we need to undergo in Europe, it's very hard to lead. And I just throw this quote that everybody knows, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's to suggest that in companies and in businesses, organizations, and government, we underestimate the impact of culture on how things get done. We have a hard time grasping what culture is. Now, if we're thinking about sort of a strategic perspective on delivering solutions, I think you could think of two ends of the spectrum. And this is a very simple funnel to just describe how an organization may actually begin to define from a set of problems to a set of solutions. Over here, you have some fuzzy notion of a problem, and you begin to figure out what that is. You write a spec, you have a brief, you have a procurement, you have some defined way of saying this is what we want, and you can deliver a solution. On this end, if I'm thinking in terms of design terms, this is strategic design, because by actually rethinking and helping frame the problem, I can lead this process to a very different solution. And on the other hand, we have service design. Now in government, we began to wake up to this idea of service design, meaning that the quality of the services we deliver in government could be better. And so we're beginning to bring some of those innovation tools that businesses have been familiar with how we deliver over here. But I've been arguing that that's not enough. That's not going to fundamentally change government. Because if we don't ask ourselves whether we're even delivering the right services in the first place, we'll just make the wrong services more pleasant. So you need to have a strategic component to this, not just a process improvement component to this. Let me talk about the two ends of the spectrum with two simple examples. The systemic end, the fuzzy problem end of things. Okay, so this is a map, many of you have seen it. It was a map that the US military prepared to help win the war in Afghanistan. And when the general presented this at the first press conference, halfway through the presentation he stopped and started laughing. And he said, you know what, by the time we figure out how this map works, the war will be over. This is just to suggest and to point out that it's not that governments or big businesses don't understand that there are big complex issues out there. The problem we have in common is we lack the tools to deal with these problems. Now, when I was in Helsinki, I mentioned, I worked for the government, for an innovation fund, and we developed a real estate project in downtown Helsinki. We had a city block, and the idea of the city block was actually to create a new marketplace. And the marketplace was for zero carbon development. How do we make our cities grow zero carbon? Now, to do that, I need to have architecture involved because I'm building a building, right? But I also need energy and energy policy. In Finland, we love zero energy homes. And I would say, you know, I could care less about zero energy homes because if my home is here and I work over here, I will undermine all the benefits accrued at the house level by added transportation. So zero energy is only good if I start talking it in relation to planning. So zero energy is here and zero work is here. Now that's good. But what if I have zero energy as well integrated with planning and work, and I like to eat 5 kilos of Brazilian meat a day, or I'm creating carbon somewhere else. So I need to bring the behavioral aspect in here. And now you begin to see that this question of climate change from a city perspective is really complex. How do you bound it? How do you get these different professions to actually work in a highly integrated way? Because guess what? The problem and the barriers in government exist also in government and businesses. And as I said, these are different ministries that have all the incentives not to work in an integrated manner. Now, at the end of the day, we delivered the building, but that was a Trojan horse for what we were really doing. Because to deliver a new kind of solution, a new way of building a city, we had to do all this other work. We had to bring in a completely new retail and service model to the block. Because we needed businesses that could sustain a zero carbon lifestyle and not actually promote a high carbon lifestyle. These were smaller businesses whose ability to pay rent was very volatile. And hence your leasing model and your business model for real estate had to change. We also had legal frameworks because we had a mixed-use block and we had to figure out ways in which things could be shared so it could be more energy and resource efficient. We had to actually activate citizens because businesses told us, real estate developers told us, they know the market. And yet when I was looking at the newspaper in Finland, the Sunday newspaper for apartments, new buildings, they all look the same in Finland. And so while they may know the market, the idea was you can have any kind of apartment as long as it's black, right? It's a sort of Ford concept. And we went and we talked to actually potential buyers. And we realized there was an untapped market that was frustrated with the current offering and was willing to put their money somewhere else. We actually showed that there was a market there to be had. And we had to change the fire regulations to make the wood aspect, the material and the energy in the materials be part of the equation. Who's doing this work? Who is providing on our large governmental and social challenges the architecture of the solution? No one. Every ministry, every business is working on one little bit, and while each one may be well-intentioned, a lot of good ideas don't add up to a great idea. In fact, frequently a lot of ideas add up to zero sum. And we see this in healthcare in the US. There's more innovation than ever before, and yet healthcare as a whole is in decline and costs are going up. So somebody's got to own strategically this issue. Public services, the other end of the spectrum. Why is it that in government it's okay to deliver services that most of us would find appalling if encountered in any business? No one would even accept the level of services that some governments deliver and some departments if it was a business. And why can't it be inverted? We put Jana here, we hired her, and her purpose was to go into the Department of Social Services in Helsinki and help deliver the internet, the digital interface between families in crisis and the department. Now these were families with children, they might have alcohol or abuse problems, and we found out that these were the families that needed the most help and that had the greatest problem finding help. And what would happen? Imagine, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, we have a crisis at home, I have a 2-year-old daughter. One of the channels to get help is the internet today. And if I go and I put Helsinki Social Services, I get a website that tells me how the organization is organized. Do you think I care? Do I think I care that they have 7 departments and who heads those departments? No. I need help. And we need to realize that in that world, the standard is being set by Google, by others. And actually, Google is the fastest way for me to figure this out. So we said we need to invert the logic. It's not about telling how we're organized, but actually understanding what the need is in organizing yourself around this. We delivered a web page, an alpha model, very quickly, that only had a number, it had a drop-down menu, where you live, and it told you the name of the person that was available right now and their phone number. You could actually just call somebody and get first help. No other information on the website for the minute. We did a public procurement decision in 4 days. We had this new service out live for citizens in 2 weeks. How many businesses can do that with that kind of an impact on about 1 million people? So when government is smart, it can use that huge muscle to move very quickly. We did city planning the same way. We took the city planners into the marketplace to have a dialogue, not expected citizens to come to City Hall to have a hearing. So innovating government, I'm wrapping up here. 3 basic ideas. One is, let's take on these impossible challenges, not as a big burden, but as a huge opportunity. This is Constitución in Chile in 2010. The city was damaged by a tsunami, completely obliterated, about 50,000 people. The city leadership had a very important decision, how to rebuild. Do we do it the way we've always done? Keep in mind that in Helsinki, rebuilding master planning processes take 10 to 15 years. 10 to 15 years for a bunch of people to agree on where the lines are on a piece of paper. And then we're going to start building, and in about 25 years we'll have houses for people. They said, not acceptable. We're going to do what it usually takes 15 years, we're going to do it in 90 days. And that was such an impossible task that it made everybody realize that everything they knew, they had to forget. This was not about borrowing past models and making it more efficient, but by redesigning. They set up a tent, which was their design tent, with a list of priorities. They had citizens come and give feedback, but they activated their civil servants into everybody's homes to have conversations about the need. 90 days later, they had a master plan on the table. They voted in the city, and 97% of the citizens voted for that master plan. So you can see, when you do things completely differently, the opportunity is to do things faster, cheaper, and fundamentally better. Not about process improvement. The second is, when you're thinking about the future, you need to act in a proposition-based way. Because the future is not here, necessarily. People may not have solved that solution. So doing analysis of the different ways of solving this problem is probably futile, right? So you need to say, what if we did this? What if we did this? A much more iterative way of working. And it's also a way to risk manage. Because as you do take small steps, you don't create huge failures in the end. And the third one is to think about citizens first, actually understanding the need out there. This was a crepe van that appeared in downtown Helsinki, and the city was confused. Actually, for the city, it was illegal because the city could not figure out whether this was a car or a restaurant, because we have 2 different departments for that. And so it was illegal. And the problem was that the city has its own logic, and it doesn't realize that the world has a completely different logic. And what had to happen was the inversion, is to say, how could the city promote something like this, as opposed to say, because it doesn't fit our logic, it can't exist. So they shut down. But they went on, and they created what's called Restaurant Day in Helsinki. And what's Restaurant Day? Anybody can open up a restaurant without a license on a given day in their homes, as illegal as it gets. We do it twice a year. The last time we had it, 1,600 restaurants popped up for one day. So what do you do as a government? You arrest these people? You go to Facebook and arrest Facebook because it's a platform for people to organize? There's new realities happening amongst people that defy all the logics of how departments and structures work. So we need to understand those. So 2 things, the political and the business challenge. The political challenge is not to think of this as process improvement, but understand that this transformation we're undergoing is about fundamentally redesigning. Don't believe that the crisis is the mother of invention. We somehow think that when we get a really bad crisis, it will bring the best out of us. Guess what? In Europe, it tends to bring the worst out of us. And in fact, we're seeing with the Greek crisis that as Greek crises come, the ability to think strategically actually disappears. And you make worse decisions, not better decisions. The idea that government is already innovating is terrible. Because I go and talk to governments and say, yeah, we're doing it, we're doing it, we're doing it. which allows them to not actually do it. They set up projects here and there, but they're not fundamentally changing things. And you need to create a new kind of leadership for this context. It's not the transformation from farms to cities, from agrarian to industrial. It's a new kind of context. How do you lead in that context? And what is the business opportunity? Well, in England, when the UK Cabinet Office established government digital services and understood that government digital services were not an IT challenge, but were a service challenge that used IT capabilities, they changed the way they procured. They used to procure all IT services from 5 providers in England. And when they changed it, they brought in a team that was a design team, understanding how services and what the service need is. They opened it up to 1,200 providers today. So governments can create huge markets for businesses to operate. And this is a vision I want to leave you with. We talk about the best place to live. I'd like to advocate for the best place to die. And Finland, as I said, is the second fastest growing country in terms of aging. We have a very birth-centric society. We have all the metrics for good birth and what happens from that end. But if we look at life from the other end, we have no metrics for good dying. Meaningful dying. I have a 97-year-old grandmother still, and I understand the importance of a meaningful death. What happens not in the last seconds, but the last 10 or 20 years. And if we can figure out this problem, because it's a huge problem for us, not only will we solve our own problem, but we'll create new businesses, new capabilities that will be needed across the world. Because wait 5 minutes, and China is going to have this problem, and they're going to be looking for market providers in this realm. So 5 quick priorities for government. There needs to be a public mandate to innovate, not just administrate. We need to put real money to play, not just money to make what happens already happen faster and more cheaply. We should think, not smaller government, how about doing mergers and acquisitions? When businesses become really dumb and slow and big, how do they become innovative? By buying innovation in. Why couldn't government think of this? Why can't government bring in the best teams to actually work inside government? Create career paths. There's not enough of innovation knowledge and the business side coming into government and government knowledge going into business. And we need to think about where we build that innovation capability. Do we bring the freedom to do things completely differently? On the outside of government, easy, but it will be irrelevant to government. Put it in the heart of government, could have a lot of leverage on how government behaves, but it's not going to do anything differently because it's going to have to subscribe to all the rules of government. I think an inside-outside model. Give it complete freedom to behave differently, but give it access to the heart of government. So my question is, who's redesigning your government? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Steinberg. Thank you very much indeed. And we have very tight schedule today, so we have time only for one question. Here you are. Someone has to bring the microphone here.
Yes, sorry for talking too much.
Hi. Really great presentation, and actually every time I was saying Finland, I was understanding it's about Lithuania, and it's a big pity Prime Minister has left before.
You mean the Minister of Transportation, which is...
exactly.
Yeah, which is also responsible for communication and even informational society creating in Lithuania. The Minister of Transportation.
Yep. So you see, it's completely the same. So the question here is, what will be the first step to make and to start that change that is that much needed?
Well, I try to, it's a really important question. I mean, that's the sort of the key, right? I try to outline. I think there needs to be actually, first of all, just a recognition of what's our challenge. And I think too much of the focus right now is somehow the notion that if we just squeeze a little more efficiency out of things, things will be fine. Actually, to acknowledge, no. When you're cutting a budget by 50%, if I give you a car and I say take half the tires away and give you half the engine, you don't get a smaller car. You can make a motorcycle out of that, but you need somebody to sit down and rethink how those new resources could work completely differently together. So that's number one. And the second one is a clear political mandate to innovate government itself. And I know it's really difficult in a time of austerity to say, you know what? I know, elderly people aren't getting the services they need, and we know that the school system's not quite working, but we're going to put 2% of our revenue to help innovate ourselves. But until we do that, we're not going to change. And then the third thing is we need to bring new capabilities in. People in government are doing a fantastic job given the conditions they have. And there are a lot of people who are really good at certain tasks, but not good at the task of thinking what could be. And a little bit like we heard before, at different moments in evolution, whether it's a business or government, you need to bring different kinds of people in. And we don't have those kinds of people that can create the what-if stories in government. So recognize the problem, give a clear mandate to innovate government itself, and resource it, budgets and new kind of HR.